Very good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Festival of Bharat. I'm Sharan Sethi and I'm your host. Today, we are joined by a very special guest all the way from the United States. She is the executive director and co-founder of Hindu American Foundation, and the foundation has been doing an incredible amount of work in terms of policy awareness, advocacy, grassroots awareness, and even community service for that matter. And they have an amazing repository of information about Sanatana Dharma. You should check out their website. Please join me in welcoming Suhag Shuklaji. Suhagji, thank you so much. Namaste and welcome.
Namaste. Thanks for having me.
And how's the situation in America as far as the pandemic is concerned? I hope things are slightly better now.
They are, think more and more people are getting vaccinated, although we do have, unfortunately, it's been politicized here. So,
Right.
um, but now as things were starting to open up, it feels like things are normal, but with Omicron kind of looming and with not much information about it, we'll see how it goes. But I'm a hopeful
Right.
and we'll see. I'm very thankful for the power of science.
Absolutely. So, Auntie, let me begin by asking you this. How is the Indian community, or rather, should I say, Hindus, perceived in the United States of America as far as Americans are concerned, for that matter?
Yeah, it's largely a positive story, but it's also kind of what I see as a bipolar story, and that is that you know Hindus have really been able to integrate into the United States, freely practice our traditions, build institutions to help us protect and preserve Sanatan Dharma, and celebrate our culture.
Right.
And then also in the workplace, we know that our community has seen tremendous success. So that's the positive story. And in terms of specifically Hinduism or Sanatan Dharma, you see the popularity, the tremendous popularity in Hindu spiritual practices or wellness
Right.
practices like yoga or Ayurveda, and thousands of Americans being drawn to these traditions and benefiting from them. So
Right.
that's the positive side. Now, on the flip side, and this is why I describe it as bipolar, is that you have these latent stereotypes, the caste cow's karma or caste cow's curry that
Right.
many people talk about, where what the tradition, how it's taught about, and how it's talked about in school textbooks or in the media is very stereotyped and largely negative.
Right.
So you have same thing. I'll use the yoga industry as an example. On the one side, you have millions of people being drawn to these traditions and benefiting from them. But then you have the commercial aspect of it
Right.
that try to de-link it
Yeah.
from the Hindu tradition, right? And people can check out our Take Back Yoga
Right.
campaign, in which we sought to start awareness about relinking the Hindu roots to the popularity of yoga. And it really sparked an international conversation.
Right. I'm really glad that you brought up the issue of commercialization of yoga, because we in India here, when we hear about things like goat yoga, we're nothing but surprised. So the amount to which
Yeah.
this has been commercialized is frankly ridiculous.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, goat yoga is more benign in comparison to some of the other things like beer yoga, cat yoga, I mean, you name it.
Right. But if I may ask you something more serious, we've observed the recently concluded Dismantling Global Hindutva Conference, and this is a worrying development. Now, of course, there are several other statements being made that this is the freedom of speech and there is academic freedom, all said and done, and we respect that, of course, in India and in America. There seems to be a definitional issue, because on one hand they say that Hinduism and Hindutva are different, but you look at the proceeds and the minutes of the conference, they finally conclude that no, everyone are the same and that this is a very regressive culture. And that is where I have a problem, right? More than
Yeah.
anything else, I think there has been a lot of analysis of what exactly happened in the conference. But what I want to understand from you is what factors do you attribute this growing Hindu phobia to?
Sure. So let's talk about Hindu phobia. I'm going to talk about it in two ways. First is, and they are related. So first, specifically to the conference, and then more broadly, just Hindu phobia in general. So with the conference itself, very much it's a political game.
Right.
These are scholar activists who are opposed to the current party and the prime minister. So they are opposed to the BJP and they're opposed to Prime Minister Narendra Modi. And that to me is the root cause of all of this. They
Right.
present the current government as one that is taking away the rights of religious minorities in India, and that this current government is a danger to democracy.
Right.
And so that's kind of the motivating factor. And then what they do is that any opposing, they use, first of all, really kind of exaggerated language like
Right.
fascism or supremacy and those types of things. And then they go on to label any opposing viewpoint as that, as fascist, as Nazi, as supremacist. And
Right.
so it's not an academic exercise if you are, rather than debating and talking about specific policies and actually inviting opposing viewpoints or neutral viewpoints. At that point, I think you could say that it's an academic exercise. But when you just have voices from one spectrum, and then you use these types of labels, I would say it's not even constructive political engagement. It's just, I don't even know what sort of word to put on it. I guess it's activist in that sense. I mean, activist can also be constructive and it can be destructive.
Right.
And I would put this in the latter. Now, talking about Hindu phobia more broadly, I think, there's obviously Hindu phobia that's rooted in political motivations, but I think that there's also Hindu phobia that's rooted in the notion of religious exclusivism.
Right.
Those traditions that believe that they are the only truth, the only way, are afraid of Hinduism. And I actually, a lot of people say, oh, don't use the word phobia. And I would encourage people to go to understandinghinduphobia.org to see what a working definition of the word is. But these are traditions that see Hinduism as a false religion. And for centuries, probably millennia, they have attempted to annihilate Hinduism through conversion and through violence. Now, the fact is that we're still here. And in fact, we're growing in popularity. People for millennia have come to India to find answers to their spiritual questions. People around the world are turning to things like go to yoga and Ayurveda and
Right.
more pluralistic understandings of our place in the world, our relation with something greater than ourselves. And so therein lies the constant reminder that the efforts to destroy Hinduism have been a colossal failure. And
Right.
that's where the other side of Hindu phobia comes into play. And very often, the political and this other kind of religious motivation, I do think, do come together.
Right. Very beautifully put. In fact, this reminds me of a particular video that went viral right after President Trump took office in way back in 2016, where a British comic, Jonathan Pye, I don't know if you watched this particular video, but he was basically criticizing the far left for being, should I say, for using labels and terms like fascism and white supremacy for everything. Of course, there is a certain amount of truth to what they say, but I think it's an exaggerated thing, especially when it comes to India. I'm glad that you bring this up. Um, I went
Let me
to.
just put one point on that. I mean, at the conference, they were trying to equate Hindu supremacy with white supremacy, which is
Right.
ridiculous. I mean, if any Hindu, of course, there are a growing number of Hindus who are not of Indian descent or Indian origin, but if I showed up at a white supremacist rally, I hardly think that I would be welcome with open
Right.
arms. So there's just such a inherent hypocrisy and lack of logic in many of
Right.
the arguments that they try to make, and then they cover up by using, this like exaggerated language.
Right. I was going through your website and I found a lot of information that frankly is very interesting to begin with. One of the mentions was about the predatory proselytization in America, because America, as the land of the free, has protected religious freedom over the years. But you see that dynamic, that sort of status quo being upset. So, do you think this is a big issue in America?
So I would say that predatory proselytization, and to define the term, it's actually a term that I coined.
Right.
I'm a lawyer by training, and one of the things that we learn about is predatory lending and predatory advertising. And this
Right.
is when a specific group is targeted as a result of certain vulnerabilities. This might be economic vulnerabilities, it might be educational vulnerabilities. And so there is latent in that, or within that, this idea that you're using unethical means. It could be force. It could be, holding certain much needed humanitarian assistance hostage unless you are willing to convert. That's what falls under the rubric of predatory proselytization. So
Right.
when I was looking at this, or rather when we were looking at this challenge, we were largely focused actually on India and what's called the 1040 window. This
Right.
is kind of a longitudinal and latitudinal geography. It includes the African subcontinent, parts of the Middle East, as well as India and Asia, that evangelicals have targeted for mass conversion.
Right.
But that said, so that's where you see it happening, predatory proselytization happening in a manner that's widespread. In the United States, it's going to be a little bit more subtle. On college campuses, for instance, there are ministries that are focused on targeting Hindu students, and they'll have tactics that are kind of disturbing. And so I'll give you an example. One pamphlet, they actually had a conference in which Christian students that are evangelical, now not all Christians, there have been changes within the Christian worldview, and there are some denominations that are more pluralistic than others.
Right.
But evangelicals, not even all evangelicals, but some of the more conservative ones, definitely engage in conversion and see Hinduism as a false religion. So in
Right.
these conferences, they encourage students to befriend Hindu students, to start asking questions as if they are curious about it. Then they'll say, "Oh, host a Bollywood event or invite them over and celebrate Diwali." And so they really use these tactics in which they are building a friendship, but the friendship is all on a false premise. Eventually, just as we see in India, there's some encouragement of, okay, you have all of these deities, but look, if you put your faith in Jesus, all these good things are going to happen. And then slowly you can get rid of all your other false gods and put Jesus there as your savior. So that's one example. Another example is with the Bhutanese refugee community. And here, maybe the proselytization that we're seeing is probably closer to what we might see in India. The Bhutanese, as many people in your audience may know, in the late 90s and in the 2000s, the king of Bhutan and the government implemented kind of a one nation, one people policy in which many Bhutanese of Nepali origin, probably a vast majority of whom were practicing Hindus, were forced to leave their homes and
Right.
they spent decades in UN administered refugee camps until they were resettled. So the United States has gotten anywhere from 60 to 100,000 Bhutanese refugees, and then many have moved to Canada, Australia, and other countries. Now, what happens when you're a refugee, when you come to the United States, is you get kind of plugged into resettlement services. Many of these services are run by faith-based communities
Right.
and faith-based organizations. So some of these organizations have been known to not during working hours when they're actually providing the services, because the U.S. law would prohibit basically using state funds to proselytize. But these
Right.
types of things happen more subtly after hours. Again, having social events where you look like you're celebrating the culture. But slowly but surely, a message is conveyed that to be more American or to be able to get a better job, being Christian would be beneficial. And so you have a population that was already targeted on the basis of their religion and cleansed from their homeland, to
Right.
now kind of face a second level of that sort of targeting and persecution.
Right. Thank you so much for that elaborate answer. In fact, I have two eerily similar examples to just cite. One is that I just stumbled across a documentary on Netflix, which was basically covering the state of different prisons around the world. And they go to Paraguay, where it's one of the worst prisons. I don't recall the name, where there are a lot of rapists and murderers and drug convicts.
Mhm.
Essentially, what the church has done there is that if you come to the Sunday mass and if you take up religion very seriously, then we give you better facilities, because that prison was overcrowded to an extent where it was holding nearly 3,000% more prisoners than it can actually hold. So,
Wow.
in a way in which the church was incentivizing was like, if you behave well, if you come to the church, then we give you all the better facilities within the prison. Otherwise, tough luck, sleep in the dorm.
Right, right.
And personally, if I have to recall, in college, I had this very eerily similar experience where because I've only studied in Catholic institutions all my life. And of course, many of them are very nice people, very humble people. But there are
Mhm.
certain elements, like you just said, ultra conservative elements. And one of the days when I was having a conversation with that particular person, he said that, Sharan, don't you think, if there was only one God and one religion, every problem in the world would have been solved? At that time, it seemed like a very noble thing to say. But then now I realize it. I do realize what the intention is. Um, and let me draw your attention to another thing that I found to be very interesting and it touched me. That was on your website. Is that you're running a campaign, and you're speaking about Pakistan's stolen girls. Unfortunately, I
Yes.
don't think we are speaking about this even in India. And even as the Afghan crisis has unfolded and the US had a very embarrassing exit from Afghanistan, I think there are very few human rights reports as to what is actually happening to Hindu minorities in those countries. Do you have
Yeah.
statistics as to what exactly is happening to these Pakistani Hindu girls?
I do. I do. And first of all, I just want to thank you for taking time to do the research and spending time on our website. So I would encourage people to do the same, especially if they're interested in human rights. We have been documenting human rights atrocities against Hindu minorities since our inception. It was actually one of the reasons that we decided that it was important to have an institution that was professionalized, that had full-time staff with subject matter expertise that would document these types of issues to bring about awareness so that we as Americans could encourage our government to do more in bringing light to these issues and alleviating the suffering that millions of people are facing, and specifically Hindus are facing in Pakistan, in Bangladesh, in Afghanistan, Malaysia, Trinidad, Tobago. These are some of the countries in which there are Hindu diasporas and or indigenous Hindu populations that are persecuted on the basis of their own, because of their religion. Now, many of these issues also overlap with other religious minorities. Pakistan is a good example. In Pakistan, annually, some 1,000 Hindu and Christian girls, largely some Sikh in there as well, are stolen from their families And so since 2011, we're talking about 10,000 girls who have been abducted. And the issues that they face are they're abducted, they are forced to convert, and these conversions are certified in mosques. Usually they're minors, so they are not even capable of giving consent for conversion. They are then forcefully married, often to, men who are 2 to 3 times their age, and they're strangers to them. And then they're raped, and there's forced separation from their families. Oftentimes, what happens in these situations is that once the girl is converted, is put the fear of life into her, and basically is told that if you say that this was not voluntary, we will kill your family. And so you have these young, vulnerable girls who have already faced such unimaginable violence, then having to live in fear, because if they do speak the truth about the circumstance, they could very well endanger their families. And so this is an issue that we're going to be launching our campaign, Save Pakistan's Stolen Girls, in the coming weeks. And we're hoping to generate international attention on this issue so that the Pakistani government does more to protect these girls, and other neighboring countries can also ensure that that they also make it part of their foreign policy, right. Whether it's putting pressure on the government or creating amnesty. So places like India with the Citizens Amendment Act has obviously tried to address this issue of religious persecution of minorities in Pakistan, but to ensure that future victims have some sort of avenue to relief and to safety.
Right. I mean, thanks to the internet, that more and more people can easily access a lot of the information that you have on Pakistan's stolen girls. And it's a very, very noble cause that you're doing. Very good luck with that. And if we could play a small role in amplifying what you are trying to say, I think it would be a great thing. But having said that, since we are speaking about the internet as well, how do I put this? Okay, so since there is a lot of Hindu phobia as well, as far as Hindus across the world are concerned, that also somehow translates into Hindu phobia on the internet, don't you think?
Yeah, it does. It does. I mean, basically, what's happened is the Hindu phobia. So it's a double-edged sword. One is that Hindu phobia, whether it comes in the religious form or in the political form, is amplified. At the same time, that also makes us more aware. We have been working on these issues for well over a decade and a half. And one of the greatest frustrations was that the average Hindu didn't even know that all this was happening, because it was kind of isolated in the ivory tower. It was isolated on the ground where, the most vulnerable areas in India or in the most remote schools in the United States that might be isolated and rural. That's where these things were happening. But so on the one hand, you get it amplified, but on the other, you are able to build awareness around it, because the only way to challenge Hindu phobia is by speaking out against it and by educating people about what our tradition authentically is and how it informs us on being contributing citizens in our respective communities. So there's that opportunity as well with the internet, and that is to promote more authentic, accurate understandings about our tradition.
Right. And since the ultra-conservatives in the West somehow portray Hinduism to be very regressive towards homosexuality and LGBT rights and marriage equality, for that matter, could you share some of the information that you have and insights that you have to prove that this is not necessarily true?
Absolutely. It's interesting. I think that even in India, there we have, people have internalized Victorian values without even knowing it. And they're not aware of the openness that our tradition has had since time immemorial, towards issues like gender and gender fluidity, and this idea that all of us have both masculine and feminine within us,
Right.
or even that, the soul has no gender; it's beyond gender. So when a soul takes root in a physical body, our tradition has very open and very, I guess, I kind of hesitate to use the word, but I mean it in its truest sense, has very progressive ideas
Right.
about homosexuality. And I
Absolutely.
think that it's a way in which people who might find that they are gay or lesbian, they can turn to the tradition and find validation, because what our tradition says is that the ultimate goal for us is to actually transcend our desires, to so that in many ways, if you have, say, a homosexual couple who is, has, in a healthy relationship, that are not just, married to their senses, and their senses are driving them one way or the other, versus, say, someone's heterosexual and is driven only by desire, that perhaps the homosexual is more spiritually evolved in having that control of
Right.
mind and controlling of senses. So in that sense, it provides a pathway for spiritual growth and spiritual evolution, and doesn't discriminate on, what, who we're attracted to, or who we love.
Right. And one more very interesting campaign that I saw on your website was prevention of Hindu students from being bullied. Now, I generally did not have a clue that this would happen in the United States. I was aware about it for the first time when I saw your website. For our audience who are probably not aware about it, can you please tell more about this?
Yeah. So the experience of growing up as a Hindu in the United States is very different, from when you're kind of just surrounded by Hindus or by Hindu culture.
Right.
And so, there's a lot of times where many young Hindu Americans are kind of growing up with two personalities in one sense. One at home that's probably maybe more traditional, where you're learning about the tradition and the values and seeing them in practice on a day to day basis. And then you have kind of the broader American culture. And so very often, just that in and of itself can be confusing for young Hindus growing in this country, because you're so different from everyone else. And at a young age, the one thing that is so important, is to want to feel like you fit in, that you want to feel like you're
Right.
accepted. So on that level, you're already different. Then it gets worse by negative stereotypes that have become kind of this is what Hinduism is about, and that's how it's taught about in schools. So here, every student learns about the world's religions, or learns about world history, anywhere between sixth grade and 12th standard. And so this is where we see maybe some of those kind of baseline insecurities, or even where students were confident going in, where all of a sudden the teacher is saying, oh, Hinduism is just a caste system, it's polytheistic, it subjugates their women, it's lent to poverty in India. And all of a sudden, your teacher is teaching about your tradition, your people, your history in these very negative terms, stereotyped terms that don't comport with how you know the tradition. Or
Right.
maybe if your parents haven't articulated, say, the philosophy behind certain practices, or you might start viewing whatever you have witnessed on your trips to India through this kind of colonial lens, because that's really what those stereotypes come from. It leads to a lot of shame. It leads to other students bullying the Hindu students, saying, oh, you guys are from this horrible religion. And so it's a real problem. And what our
Right.
solution has been is empowering teachers with accurate information about Hinduism. So we have a really robust Hinduism 101 program that talks about a variety of different issues in depth, whether it's history, whether it is concepts like karma and moksha and dharma, whether it's festivals or symbols. And what we've found is teachers on the whole want to teach things accurately because they are tasked with basically contributing to the understanding of the next generation of world leaders. And we are in an increasingly globalized world where you're going to be doing business with someone from India. You're going to be interacting with someone in Malaysia who might be Hindu. And if you come out ignorant out of our American schools with these stereotypes, you're going to inhibit your ability and your ability to, first of all, just function and prosper in the business or in STEM or whatever else. But you're also going to make America look bad and ignorant. And so teachers on the whole want to get it right. And we've been able to train thousands of teachers to teach about Hinduism more accurately and say, you know what, I'm going to ignore what these textbooks say, and I'm going to go to these materials that are well vetted. We've worked with scholars and been able to put across in very simple terms some of these very complex ideas that come out of the Hindu tradition.
That's some fantastic work that you've been doing. I have to congratulate you. Do you think pop culture actually plays a role in this? Because whether it's Apu from Simpsons or even Family Guy for that matter, I'm a huge fan of Family Guy. But when I saw all those racist stereotypes about India, I was honestly very shocked.
Yeah, I mean, pop culture, when I was growing up, it was Temple of Doom. So when you are already, Raiders of the Lost Ark, sorry, it was, I can't remember which one it wasn't, but Indiana Jones was kind of that big stereotype. Absolutely, pop culture can play a role in contributing to stereotypes. But the good thing is that here now we're seeing more and more representation. Mindy Kaling had her series on Netflix. And sure, look, comedy is dependent on stereotypes. And I don't think that we should, as not just as Hindus, but as people in general, lose our sense of humor. And I do think that comedy is for sure getting hit by kind of political correctness. And the whole role of comedy from time immemorial is to kind of open our eyes to some of the things that we do as people in our communities. So trying to find that balance between having representation, then also once you have representation, I think comedy can feel a little bit more comfortable, even if it's dealing with stereotypes. But without representation, that's where I think that it can be harmful.
Right. I actually agree with you, and probably I'm going to be very unpopular for saying this. And at least in an American context, I feel that both the left and the right is very busy getting offended and being politically correct, and that is sort of just sort of coercing upon freedom of speech and whatnot. And I do completely agree with where you're coming from.
Yeah, I'll just say one thing really quickly on that, the Hindu tradition has, first of all, such a deep tradition of debate, of dialogue. We have ethics around speech, and it does not include getting offended. This whole hurting religious sensibilities that has taken hold in India, to me, is more kind of a concept of blasphemy and not something that's integral to the Hindu tradition. We also have a long tradition of satire and humor, and I think we as a people need to rediscover those roots.
Right, very aptly put. America is very unfortunately facing an astronomical number of racist crimes, even today after so many years. Among those affected today are also Asians, and especially because of a quote unquote right wing government being in place in India. And even because of the COVID-19 pandemic, a lot of the Chinese diaspora are being attacked as well. I mean, we have to acknowledge what's really happening in America. So, based on your situation and the ground understanding of what you have, is the situation getting better as far as Indians are concerned? And do you also think that this is being covered enough in American media?
Right. So, hate crimes and specifically hate crimes against Hindus is, I think, knowing the extent of it is a work in progress. It was only a few years ago that the FBI, which is our Federal Bureau of Investigation, started requiring law enforcement agencies to collect information on Hindus as a specific category for hate crimes. And so, what a hate crime is that it's any ordinary crime. However, if part of the motivation was based on race, religion, or national origin, then it comes into the category of a hate crime. So the types of hate crimes that we see range the gamut. It can be vandalism and desecration of Hindu temples, which we've seen happening in Georgia, in Seattle, and in other places where temples are targeted, they're broken into, and our murtis or our deities are destroyed, or there's horrible racist phrases might be spray painted. We've also seen murders with the high profile murder of Srinivas Kochibutla several years ago in Kansas. Now, there it was kind of a mix of mixed of identity where the person who shot him mentioned that foreigners were taking away jobs. Then he called him someone from the Middle East. So very often that also confuses the statistics, specifically about whether a person was targeted as a result of being Hindu. What's key to preventing these things? One is being armed with statistics. If we have better statistics, we might be able to identify patterns that, oh, hey, all of a sudden in this region, we've seen a higher number of incidents where Hindus are being targeted. We've seen that sort of targeting, for instance, in Virginia, where there was a particular neighborhood where there are a lot of people of Indian origin. Now, are all of them Hindu? Not necessarily, but oftentimes, there was, I think, spray paint that said "Go back Hindu" or something like that. So there, it's kind of it's a fluid way in which we have to look at these crimes, because for our particular situation, three things might overlap: national origin, where someone might have been from India. Now, a person like me, I was born and raised here, so I'm not originally from India. However, I am of Indian descent. So descent might play into it, and then religion might play into it. But I would say the another important aspect, and that's one that we can participate in, and we have been, is educating our local law enforcement about what Hinduism is about, where our temples are in a local vicinity, what a hate crime might look like. So we've worked with the US Department of Justice to give kind of hypotheticals that better educate law enforcement on how to identify a hate crime and whether the possibility might be motivation of someone's Hindu or Indian identity.
Since you also mentioned that there were a few incidents where Hindus were shot at, do you think this has a connection with the current gun law debate that's going on?
Yeah, I mean, guns is a whole debate in and of itself. And we have, at least at the foundation, taken the stance that we need more common sense legislation.
Right.
The United States Constitution does guarantee a right to bear arms, but that is not an unlimited right. And right now, we do have an epidemic of gun-related deaths and gun-related casualties, and we as a nation have to grapple with these very real issues that endanger everyday Americans. I mean, just last in the last few weeks, a young student brought a gun to school and shot other students, and his parents had bought the gun. So there's in some parts of the United States a real gun culture, and so that's what kind of complicates things, because for those people, any sort of regulation is seen as a regulation of their privacy and their right to own guns. So it's a complicated issue, but one that's been ongoing. I'm hoping that we can at least get some common sense regulations around it, like background checks and registration, and having some sort of database so that we at least have some sort of accounting of how many guns are out there.
Right. And before we conclude, can you tell us more about your Shakti initiative?
Yes, absolutely. The Shakti Initiative is something that's very close to my heart. I pursued a bachelor's in religion for my undergraduate degree, and my focus was on women in Hinduism. And in fact, I wrote a thesis. My senior thesis was "The Vedic Woman, Who Was She and When Will She Return?" And so I had, while I saw the challenges that Hindu women face in society, I knew that the philosophy was very not even just egalitarian, but it put the feminine divine on a pedestal, but it also put the role of women and women in general on a pedestal. However, if you Googled Hinduism and women, you would largely find negative stereotypes about Hinduism being misogynistic, or, if rapes were happening in India, that somehow they were rooted in the Hindu tradition, as opposed to looking at rape in India as you would look at rape in any other culture, as a horrible human negative tendency. And so we felt that it was important to have a resource where people who are interested in learning about the feminine divine, or what Hinduism has to say about a variety of different issues, from the philosophical to the mundane, that there would be a centralized clearinghouse. And from that, the Shakti Initiative was born. And so we're always looking for people who might be interested, who have a good skill set in writing. If there's a particular topic that they would like to write about, it can be about a historical figure, it can be about a deity, it can be about a social contemporary issue. But it's a place for us to highlight teachings about women. And I think that one of the powerful things about, maybe we can call it a Hindu feminism, is that because we have this idea of Shiva Shakti as being two parts of one whole, because we have this idea that each one of us can manifest both feminine and masculine principles, that it doesn't become pro-female, anti-male, which is what happens in a lot of iterations of feminism. But it tries to find ways in which both men and women, or anyone who doesn't necessarily identify as either, can come together to contribute to the positive wellness of all people, regardless of how we identify.
Right. It's an absolute pleasure talking to you, Sohagji. And I've personally learned a lot from what you had to say. And I'm extremely inspired by the work that Hindu American Foundation has been doing. So a very good luck to you and your initiatives. And I hope you can join us again for a conversation.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for your insightful questions and really doing homework. It really helps have a deeper conversation. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much. Namaste.
Namaste. We hope you enjoyed this Chitti Media content. Please remember to subscribe to us and switch on the notifications for this channel. For our other social media links, more content, and to support our work, please visit citti.net. Dhanyavad. Namaskar.